We welcome you to the 10th Annual Sacred Trust Talks and Book Signing event here at Gettysburg National Military Park. The sponsors of this event are the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park. The Gettysburg Foundation is the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service at Gettysburg. I'm Cindy Small, Director of Marketing with the Gettysburg Foundation, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about this next presentation. Dr. Stephen Davis will discuss what the Yankees did to us, Sherman's bombardment and the wrecking of Atlanta. Longtime Atlantan Dr. Davis tells the story of what the Yankees did to his city, relying on contemporary newspaper accounts more than any previous scholar. An author with a concentration on the Civil War in Southern literature, Dr. Davis served as book review editor for Blue and Gray magazine from 1994 through 2005, and is the author of more than 100 scholarly articles. A popular speaker to Civil War roundtables and historical societies, he has spoken on what the Yankees did to us last fall to Civil War roundtables in New York and Rhode Island, and got away with it. In April of this year, he spoke at the annual meeting of the American Civil War Roundtable in London. His favorite event of last year was when he addressed President and Mrs. Carter and family on the role of Copenhill, the Carter Center site, in the Battle of Atlanta. Please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Stephen Davis. Thank you.
Thank you. Cindy, thank you for that warm welcome, and I want to thank you all. Here it is 5:30. Most of us have been here since the first talk at 9:30. The bar downtown has beckoned, but we're still here. We're talking about the war. I'm a fan of Sherlock Holmes. You may remember when he once confessed to being guilty to a monograph on the residue of Indian tobacco. Well, I am guilty of a monograph on what the Yankees did to us, Sherman's bombardment and wrecking of Atlanta. I am a longtime Atlantan since the age of 3. If I don't have a southern accent, I blame my parents, both of whom were from Oklahoma, which is the land in the Midwest of no accents at all. So thanks very much to the Foundation for having me up. And my remarks today will be outlined as follows. And by the way, William, thanks very much for setting all this stuff up. I was nicked by a spent ball in one of my dreams, and my wife asks, Steve, where'd you get that new wound? Well, we were fighting the Yankees last night. So if you can edit this out of the tape, I'd appreciate it. We'll talk about the bombardment, the occupation, engineers wrecking and burning. Then the soldiers wanted to get in on the fun. If we have time, because Dennis is a very tight time master, we'll talk about the extent of the damage to the city and maybe end up with General Sherman. Now, I am a Southerner, and some of you all may know that William Tecumseh Sherman was nicknamed Cump. I have a prized first edition of the Civil War Times Encyclopedia of the Civil War with a priceless misprint in the first edition, which was later cleaned up. It reads in the biographical entry for General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, called Chump by his friends. I've had yahoos in the SEV ask for 4 figures for that book. No, sir, it's not for sale. The bombardment. I concentrate on the bombardment because I happen to think that the burning is an overused phrase that really explains relatively little extent of damage. Much of the physical damage of the city was done during Sherman's 37-day bombardment, which began on July 20th when his first rifled guns got into range. Sherman had 254 cannon at the start of the campaign, and when I say cannon bombarding Atlanta, I'm talking about the rifled guns. 3-inch rifles, 10 and 20-pounder Parrots, of which there were about 100 guns in Sherman's batteries. So these are the ones that are bombarding Atlanta. The first northern shells fell on the afternoon of July 20th, fired by Captain Francis DeGresse's Illinois battery. If you're familiar with the other cyclorama, the Atlanta cyclorama, those are the 20-pounder Parrots near the red brick Troop Hurt house. I was in the bookstore today and I saw a novel of Virginia in the Civil War. Well, y'all, on the front page cover for the illustration, they have the painting of the Troop Hurt house from the Atlanta cyclorama. So much for Virginia's pride in their own war. Lord have mercy, they're borrowing it from ours. A.A. Holing in 1958 wrote a great book on the civilians in Atlanta, last train from Atlanta. He dedicated it to a little girl who was killed on the afternoon of July 20th by a shell. Why? This is eyewash. It's good marketing, but it's eyewash. One of the points that I will try to make is, if a little girl, y'all, was killed by the first shell falling on downtown Atlanta on the afternoon of July 20th, don't you think Confederate newspapers would have reported it? No. The first casualties weren't reported until several days later. Holing's dedication is good marketing, but it's historical falsehood. Confederates withdrew from their outer line of work, shown in the upper center, on the night of July 21-22, because, as you know, General Hood was launching attacks upon the Yankees at Peachtree Creek July 20th, 22nd east of the city, and 28th west of the city. When the Confederates withdrew from their outer line into the fortifications, the main Red Ring, then Sherman's cannon got even closer. Let's go back. And, of course, Sherman was ordering, personally ordering this artillery bombardment. He never explained his reasons, but he certainly never even told his gunners, aim for the downtown car shed, which is the main train depot. If he had wanted to do something militarily with his bombardment, he should have done that. Instead, he was just firing his cannon indiscriminately against blameless buildings and unarmed civilians. George Barnard, it is ironic that we Atlantans owe most of what we know about what the city looked like to a contract photographer hired by the Union engineers, George Barnard, who came to our city mid-September after Sherman took it, and for a couple of months took such images as this. The Ponder House in the northwest salient of Confederate works near Fort Hood. It's now the Georgia Tech campus. And you see that Lieutenant Hopkins of the Signal Service saw the hole being perforated by Sherman's guns in the firing of August 9th. Of Atlanta's population, 20,000 at the start of the year, as Sherman's armies got closer, more and more people cleared out. Some 3,000 or 4,000 civilians stayed during the bombardment for a couple of different reasons. They had nowhere to go, they were poor, they were rich and had a good basement, or they had a big backyard and they dug a bomb-proof. Here's a northern artist's view of a bomb-proof that in some cases was big enough for a couple of dozen people in there. Wilbur Kurtz, who was an avocational historian, is the angel of all of us studying Atlanta history. Kurtz in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s drew maps, had interviews, recorded everything meticulously in his notebooks. One time in the late 20s, early 30s, he was reading General Jacob Cox's memoir about how a Willis family had a bomb-proof dug near his lines. Well, Kurtz knew where Cox's lines had been in August of '64, so one Sunday, according to his notebook, he just told Annie Laurie, I'll be home by dinner. Where are you going, Wilbur? Well, I'm driving out to West End. I'm going to start asking around if anyone knows descendants of the Willises. So he knocked on the door, and the lady said, you're in luck. I'm Elizabeth Herron, daughter of Joseph Willis, and I'll tell you all about the bomb-proof. She described it to him, showed him where the hole in the wall was, the hole in the dirt was in 1932. Kurtz drew the picture, doubtless with Ms. Herron approval, and published this article in the local newspaper in 1932. God help us if Wilbur Kurtz had not done this, because Mrs. Herron was kicked by a cow a couple of months later and died of surgical complications. Had it not been for that Sunday drive and this article in the newspaper, we would not have what I will call as close to a first-hand account of a family in a bomb-proof during Sherman's nefarious bombardment. An important source is Confederate newspapers. Cindy, thanks for that plug. We have the Intelligencer. Now, sure enough, on July 10th, the Intelligencer moved most of its operation down to Macon. But it kept the foreman, Ike Trimble, issuing daily reports. Ike would walk around the city, write it down, put it on the evening train to Macon, and within 2 days it'd be published in the relocated Macon Intelligencer. Moreover, the Memphis Appeal, the city's other big paper, moved its Big Hoe press, shown on the right, to Montgomery circa July 22. But John Dumble, the editor, stayed. He found a little hand crank press, and with Pilgrim turned out a front page extra only of the Memphis Appeal every day during the bombardment until the evacuation of the city. They're hard to find, but you generally find the appeal quoted in the southern newspapers, because that extra was also put on the afternoon Macon train, reprinted in Macon, sent elsewhere. And so I was finding Memphis Appeal extras quoted in the New York Times in August of '64. For example, Pilgrim on August 4th walked around the city. I'm an old Latin major. He perambulated the premises and wrote up this story, which was published in the Intelligencer August 6th. He saw damage along Marietta Street, which is in the northwest quadrant, and that would have been closest to Geary's artillery. He also identified a shell victim or a house on Walton Street struck, and he confirmed the extent of the bomb proofs being dug in the backyards. As I say, Sherman should have directed his artillery to get at the train depot, which every day was bringing in supplies and ammo for Hood's troops. But you can see that Barnard, who took this view 2 weeks after the bombardment, 2 weeks after the Yankees took the city, shows nary a hole in it. So much for the accuracy of the artillery of Sherman's army. Well, now, when I went up north and gave this talk, I'd simply said Sherman was very intent. But when I'm down south, take this as a compliment, y'all. I kept this in here. I say Sherman was virtually obsessed with bombarding the buildings and the people, because look at the frequent and numerous orders he gave to his artillery to keep the firing up. In fact, not content with his 100 rifled guns, he ordered 4 30-pounders from Chattanooga to step it up. He wanted 30-pound shells thrown in. That's a 30-pounder rifle. Eventually, 4.5-inch siege rifles came, and on August 9th, all of them fired 50 rounds. That's a lot of steel. Here's another lot of iron. Here's a lot of Kurtz, too. Kurtz was walking around in the late 20s, and in the area that he knew to be Geary's Division 20th Corps, found 3 large artillery embrasures, larger than he had seen for Union field pieces. So he did the research. He found 3 of the 4.5-inch guns were placed there at what is today 11th Street and Cherry Street, just north of the Tech campus. He quietly inked them into this map, and he never put this into the legend. Only by reading Kurtz's notebook did I figure out what those 3 little dots below the S in Corps are. They also fired round shot heated to set fires downtown. One well-documented fire that I found in the Macon newspaper lit up the Atlanta Lard Oil Factory and the adjacent building west of the car shed. The last shell was fired on the night of August 25th because, as you know, about that time, Sherman was giving up his bombardment and his semi-siege of Atlanta and was fixing to go around with 6 of his 7 Army Corps and break the railroads north of Macon. Cindy mentioned my talk to President Carter, Mrs. Carter, and their family. When I used the word fixin', Mrs. Carter just squealed with laughter. "Steve, I love that word." And she reflected that back in the old days at White House functions, she'd perambulate the room listening for the word fixin', because she could know then she could join that group and speak among good Southerners. Fixin', y'all. True disclosure, I'm married to a Northern woman. And she says, "Steve, since I met you, there's been so much fixing going on, I think sometimes I'm married to a carpenter." We don't know how many civilian casualties. The surgeons didn't keep records. They were too hard worked. Even Ike Pilgrim could only publish hearsay rumors and later find out they were false. Sam Richards, a resident, recorded in his diary, August 21st, "We think maybe 20 civilians have been killed." And after the Yankees stopped and left, unexploded shells downtown kept detonating. And young children, foolish little children, were messing around with the shells, and further explosions occurred, causing damage to life and limb. Let's go back. The best confirmed shell casualty is an African American, a free barber, Saul Luckie, who was standing downtown on the afternoon of August 15th, we think, when the shell struck a lamppost, hit Luckie in the leg, People rushed to him, took him to Dr. Dalvigny, who was the contract surgeon at the Medical College Hospital, but he died within hours of shock, hemorrhage, blood loss, whatever. But we know that Saul Luckie was a shell casualty. That lamppost with the hole in the base caused by the Union shell stood at Alabama and Whitehall streets for years. Now it's at the same place in underground Atlanta, y'all, if you come down and visit us. Wilbur Kurtz was technical advisor to Gone with the Wind, and he would have abhorred David Selznick's decision to have the big fires in Atlanta on the night of the Confederate evacuation. Why, we know that didn't happen. The Yankees were burning up Atlanta in the several days before they left, November 15th, 16th. Kurtz would have argued against Selznick, but Selznick wanted his fire. And in fact, if you know the chronology of the film, Selznick was burning Atlanta with the old sets from King Kong and such, even before he had settled on Vivian Leigh as Scarlet. Selznick wanted his fire. The Confederates did blow up a big train load of ammo that General Hood could not get out of the city. George Barnard took the view of the wrecked train wheels, and they also burned the big Atlanta rolling mill, which rolled cannon and iron rails for the railroad. That was blowed up. The Federals occupied the city for 2.5 months. Here you see Barnard viewing them in a captured Confederate fort. 3 regiments of Union soldiers camped downtown, provost guards to keep order. Here's the 2nd Massachusetts with their shanties on City Hall. Now it's the state capitol. Now I ask you, learned ladies and gentlemen, where did the Yankees get their wood for their huts and shanties? By tearing down nearby buildings, which had largely been abandoned by civilians. I love this. Now you'll find this photograph replete in the literature, but I'm one of the few people to make this hypothesis. Look at the Federal soldier sitting in front of the slave mart, the Fraser and Crawford slave mart, which Northern soldiers abhorred seeing. What did Barnard do? He puts a soldier there in Union uniform. Look more closely. He's an African American. Sherman had no U.S. colored troops in his ground forces. So what we think happened, Barnard took a freed slave working for the Army, put him in uniform, set him in front of the slave mart, sitting with a rifle and reading a book. Why, in antebellum South, that was a crime in itself. Why do we think this is an interesting hypothesis? We think Barnard staged this as a very ironic but ironclad affirmation of the death of slavery. I think it's a wonderful photograph. Sherman took the fine house of John Neal himself for his quarters and stayed there until the morning of November 16th. Federals were not shy in publicizing their damage to the city. Look, Frank Leslie's illustrated paper in New York shows them taking down whole houses, loading doors into their wagons. And they were not shy about writing about it. Private Dunham, even some nice houses are going down. And Chaplain Height, we're using all the wood to build our huts. And Henry Dean talking about, well, it's getting cold here in North Georgia in October. We're tearing down the chimneys too and making our own. Sherman ordered all civilians to leave the city in what has been called the largest depopulation of a civilian populace in one city alone. On or about September 5th, he told the Southerners, if you want to clear out of this city, we'll put you on a wagon and take you to General Hood's lines, which are about 20 miles south of town. If you want to go north, register for train transport. You can carry some stuff. We'll carry you to Louisville, maybe even to Nashville or Louisville. We think about, let's see, 1,650 Atlantans signed up to go south. Why? Because Colonel LeDuc, who was arranging the wagon transport, had him sign a book that Tom Dyer found in the archives for his book, Secret Yankees, in 1999. I saw it when I was in Washington City in microfilm. LeDuc had all those 1,650 names entered in with the number of servants, children, and number of moo cow. It's great. But we don't have a similar book of Exodus for those going north. But from a couple of different contemporary sources, we think probably an equal number of Atlantans would have gone north. Some were permitted to stay, especially if you were a rich Northern sympathizer and had neighbors to prove it. And if you were friends of Northern sympathizers like the Berrys, you could stay. Father O'Reilly at Immaculate Conception Church downtown was the priest. He was allowed to stay. So was Dr. Dalvigny. And of course, a lot of freed people stayed under contract as workers or servants or cooks or washerwomen for the officers. Another source of physical damage to the city occurred in October when Sherman, with 3 of his corps, you remember after Hood figured out, what am I going to do? I guess I better go and descend upon Sherman's rail lines, maybe inch into Tennessee. Maybe I can get Sherman to retreat back. Well, so Hood took off into Tennessee. Sherman and 3 corps followed him for a while, but kept the 20th Corps in town and told his chief engineer, Captain Poe, the 20th Corps can't man the 12 miles of rebel fortifications. Dig a shorter line of works inside the city. You see all of those dark numbers? That's the federal line. And Captain Poe had to take down more buildings to build that. Before one went down on October 23, and we know the date because it's in his diary, he went to the top of the 3-story girls' school, Barnard did, and took these 3 views of the skyline of Atlanta. It's the best photograph of Atlanta in =64 that we have. Sherman, of course, didn't plan to stay in Atlanta for long. Even before he had entered the city, he entered on September 7th, he's thinking to Halleck, oh, let's march to the sea. Well, it took a while for Halleck, Lincoln, Secretary of War Stanton to be convinced. Halleck said, if you want salt water, march to Mobile. Lincoln was worried that if Sherman got himself bottled up in middle Georgia by rebel forces, they could win a victory, and his chances, much talked about by speakers this morning, his chances for re-election would be diminished and tarnished by that. But finally, the brass in Washington went over, and Sherman planned to march out in a while, but he pledged to destroy Atlanta. Let's see if I can get this going. Preparations began early November with trains being loaded up in the car shed, the wagons are being brought from the troops outside, carrying their stuff, being put on trains. Sherman wanted the stuff carried north, and after the last train left on the morning of November 12th, Sherman started marching into the city, tearing up the track from the Etowah River. The Western Atlantic Railroad was virtually destroyed for approximately a third of its length. Who were the last civilians to leave town those several days in November before the Yankees left? The freed people. Look at the top of that train. You see all kinds of civilian stuff. It's the ex-slaves. They hope to go north. They also hope that they can get on the train too. They're huddled off to the right. Because when the Yankees leave, guess who's coming back? Massa. So the freed people wanted to go north too. Sherman, as I said, wanted to do a number on Atlanta, and he instructed his engineers to begin laying out segments of the city for destruction. E.g., the 33rd Mass would get the commercial access of Whitehall and Peachtree. One of the maps that I am the first to publish, I'm proud to say, comes from the Cogswell papers in Massachusetts that Dyer found, but Dyer didn't use his maps. I called Irene Axelrod at the museum up in Massachusetts and asked her to photocopy Cogswell's papers. She said, Steve, do you want the manuscript letters or you want the maps too? Whoa, Irene, what maps? I didn't know it. But this is a map accompanying the report of the 33rd Mass officer showing the areas along Whitehall Street and Peachtree that are to be destroyed. But on November 7th, a week or so before he's planning to leave, Captain Poe convinced him, no, don't have the provost guards do the damage, have the engineers. They're better at destroying the buildings, and they are better at preventing irregularities, meaning Union soldiers on their own committing unauthorized arson. Sherman didn't care if Atlanta went up in flames, but he didn't want to lose control of his army before he was ready to leave. That's why he had Poe and the engineers destroy as many buildings by knocking them down, using fire only at the last minute. So you see the engineers working here, photographed by Barnard. They're photographed here, tearing up the railroad downtown. Here's another map that I got from Cogswell. It shows that Colonel George Buell's Provisional Brigade of Pioneers have designated various regiments to destroy lengths of track downtown. We also know that the trestle bridge, which Union engineers had rebuilt by August 5th, was torn down on November 13th. Sergeant Flaherty saw it being done with wires and ropes stretched on both sides, and the men would heave-ho and eventually knock down the wooden bridge. The car shed was knocked down on the morning of November 14th by huge battering rams. Sometimes when the engineers couldn't knock something down, they actually blowed it up, as Ike Roseberry, an engineer in the 1st Michigan, wrote in his diary, Microfilm at Emory. We have burnt up 2 large depots and a roundhouse. We also blowed up a stone depot with 700 pounds of powder, weather pleasant. Thanks, Ike. But the soldiers saw that the engineers were starting to tear the building up. Everyone knew that Sherman would look the other way if Atlanta went up in flames, so they started setting their own fires. The first one broke out November 11th, east of downtown. Even Roseberry entered it into his diary. Little Carrie Berry was 10 years old. She kept a great diary during the bombardment and semi-siege, so she talked about the fires on the night of November 11th. General Slocum, commander of the 20th Corps, offered a reward for arsonists, but no one turned his comrade in. Here's Carrie Berry. Look at her entries. Burning houses. They've come during the day because 13th, 14th, 15th, the men of Sherman's 3 Infantry Corps were marching into the city by way of the northwest. They started setting their fires. And the soldiers were going around setting houses on fire where there were not provost guards, according to Ms. Berry. I found this in the Wheeler papers in Montgomery. Wheeler had scouts east of the city. They saw the plumes of smoke coming up, so they knew Atlanta was a doomed place. Sherman never ordered homes in Atlanta burned. He didn't need to. Once when he was observing the burning of downtown Marietta, Major Hitchcock asked Sherman, "Aren't you worried about your name in history? Why, these men are burning down houses in Marietta, Georgia." And Sherman said, "Don't worry about it, Hitchcock. I've seen more of this stuff than you have. Besides, I'll just say Jeff Davis burnt them." Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm from the South, and President Davis down my way has been blamed for many things in the war, but the burning of Marietta, Georgia houses should not be listed among them. Why did the soldiers burn? A lot of them had already done it earlier in the year when the 15th Corps marched across with Sherman across Mississippi. The men of the 14th, 15th, and 17th Corps were marching back from northwest Georgia. They lit up whole towns or parts of them, Rome, Cartersville, and as I say, Marietta. The soldiers saw that the pioneers were having all the fun. That's a direct soldier's quote. Then on the final day of the occupation, the commissary officers were cleaning out the stores and gave the men whiskey. Okay. These sketches, made on the spot by Northern artists, were later put on the trains from Savannah and rendered into woodcuts and published beginning in early January of '65. Here's the burnings, the heaviest burnings, November 14th and 15th. Soldiers joined in. Captain Ladd's regiment from Ohio was marching into the city on November 15th. We arrived in the northwest suburbs. No sooner did we arrive than the boys commenced burning every house in that part of town. It's one of the reasons that northwest Atlanta will be documented as the hardest hit by the fires. Here's a photograph taken by Barnard after the war. It shows that the Georgia Railroad Bank Agency was burned. Well, and the building next to it was rebuilt. The building across the street, the concert hall, was burned down, and here it's rebuilt as a second-story structure. The question to you is, why did Sherman want these unoffending commercial buildings done? I found several sources of officers who said Sherman wants everything brick burned. Everything brick, because when the rebels come back, he doesn't want the rebels to use brick buildings for hospitals, warehouses, or the beginnings of factories. Here's Sherman, photographed by Barnard circa mid-September on his horse Duke. How much of Atlanta was burned? Of course, the Yankees gave lowball estimates, 25 to 37%. Confederate Militia officer William P. Howard, however, perambulated the city and thought that maybe several thousand houses had been destroyed, meaning 11/12 of the city. But his map documenting the burned areas was lost in transit. It's never been found. I suspect General Howard exaggerated the burn damage. But I have found other sources in the Confederate newspapers, some of which have not been published, like this letter from Zach Rice, talking about the extensive damage on Whitehall Street already alluded to. Let's see. My publisher let me draw my own maps. So when I saw that Whitehall Street was burned from the fortifications in, I showed it on this map in the darkened street areas. I also found that other street areas had been leveled by the Yankees, so I inked them in as well. Let's end with Chump Sherman. I can't remember who today was speaking on total war. Help me out. But I'm not sure that total war is the correct phrase. The earlier speaker, who was that? I can't remember, did use the word hard war. And let's credit. Total war, by definition, is the civilian deliberate targeting of is the military deliberate targeting of civilians. Firebombing Dresden, firebombing Tokyo. We wanted to kill the people. Hard war is the deliberate military targeting of civilians' property. Now, Sherman was a good practitioner of hard war, but he was not a practitioner of total war. I'm 65. One of the great joys of being long of tooth is that in the centennial, when I was growing up, we called Sherman the inventor of total war. 50 years later, we simply know that he was an able practitioner of hard war, as Mark Grimsley has recently put in his excellent scholarship. But Sherman, more than any other general, including Phil Sheridan, has put his face on hard war in the American Civil War. I close with this. A few years ago, I was invited by a Civil War organization to be flown to St. Louis and give a talk during a weekend meeting. Says I accept your kind and generous offer on this one condition, sir, that somewhere along the way you drive me to Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis because General Sherman is buried there and I must give my respects. All during the conference, people were coming up and asking, Steve, what are you going to say to General Sherman's grave? Don't know, thinking about it. Driving out to the airport that Sunday morning, I had my bottle of Molson's. I'm thinking hard, y'all. I wrote it down. And I read it in front of Sherman's grave as my friends photographed me. War is salty, Cindy. I hate you, you son of a bitch, for what you did to my people, my city, and that you won. But I honor you as a soldier. Peace to your ashes, an Atlantan. I folded up my note, put it in the beer bottle, and walked away. Y'all, I had done my duty just like Chump Sherman had done his. Thanks a lot. The bar's still open downtown, y'all, but if you want to kind of talk about the war a little bit. Sir.
I have a question about the number of people in Atlanta at the time. The 1860 census gives the population as about 9,500.
Yes, sir.
And you were mentioning 20,000?
We swole up, sir. With the... I'm from the South, I can say that. When cities like New Orleans, Nashville, Memphis fell, Atlanta became a haven for refugees. So the city of 9,500 or 10,000 in 1860 became a city of 18 to 20, sometimes people say 22,000 by the start of the year 64. But as I say, a good number, certainly a majority, began to clear out as Sherman got closer, and especially after around May 25th, 27th, when they could start hearing the first Yankee cannon fire. That was a signal to hasten their departure. Anything else? I will end with this. Yeah.
Let me get. Let him. Just not.
When did the population start to return to Atlanta, and what, if any, federal assistance was given?
the war. No federal aid. Maybe we didn't have Governor Christie. I don't know. Atlantans began arriving back in the city within a week of Sherman's departure. And the leading citizens returned. Governments began to be formed. Word spread. One of the reasons that Zach Rice published that column in November 20th is he wanted to assure Atlantans who had fled, look, the whole city has not been burned. So that's why he was careful to circumscribe the damage. Streets. Now, I may have lowballed the damage, but I was working from such newspaper accounts as that Augusta columnist and Zach Rice. I'm going to close with this as an example of 150 years after the war, and we're still learning. My publisher chose this Barnard photograph of Union engineers tearing up the railroad using Captain Poe's cant hooks. Well, Dr. Jolly asked, well, Steve, okay, if we use this, can you describe it a little bit more somewhere? Sure. Mark, look at this. The car shed's down. We know that was torn down by the engineers on the morning of November 14th. But the three-story concert hall is still standing, and it wasn't destroyed until the fires of the afternoon of November 15th. So this photograph was taken by Barnard sometime on the afternoon of the 14th or the morning of the 15th. I was explaining this at a Civil War Roundtable meeting, and the guy next to me at the dinner table said, Steve, you're not a student of photography, are you? Says I, no, I'm not. Steve, the eye follows the shadows. Sure enough, look down here. The shadows are down here. Barnard was taking this view looking northwest up Marietta Street, past the car shed, past the concert hall. The shadow's on the right, so the sun would have been on Barnard's left. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the first to be able to say that this photograph by George N. Barnard was taken on the afternoon of November 14th, 1864. And you know what? If that's my only contribution to the sesquicentennial literature, Cindy, I'm still proud. Thanks a lot, y'all.